What's the?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's.
I might as well kick this off. My name is Ron Wilcox. I live in Sandy Hook. And what I think is really, really irresponsible is for any legislation to be proposed the way it's been proposed, the way it's been rushed through, without you as a body that represents us standing up and saying, wait, we want to see all of the police evidence, we want to see all of the facts, whether you're pro-Second Amendment or anti-gun. I think a full investigation is warranted before any legislation comes forward, and that hasn't taken place. This has just been ran through, and I've yet to see anybody in the House or the Senate stand up as a body and say this is wrong. As a group, let me please finish, Dan. You know, we had some conversations last night in Newtown. We can continue along that vein. Just for the record, I am somebody who believes the fact that we're a republic. We're not a democracy. We don't rule on emotion and we don't rule on mobs. We rule based on the Constitution and the rule of law. So as far as the Second Amendment, I hold that sacred. But the other thing that I find very troubling is that our Senate minority leader is leading the charge on this, and some of the legislation that he's proposing is extremely offensive to Second Amendment advocates. And in New Britain last week, he made statements that part of his idea for legislation is born out of emotion and how close he is to the Newtown community. That being the case, have any of you stood up and asked him to recuse himself from these proceedings?
Well, he actually, this is John McKinney, and I worked
It
with
is
John
John.
in the Senate. He, as was just mentioned, this was a very unusual bipartisan effort. Typically, when there's a supermajority party who controls just about everything that happens up there, and they want to be bipartisan, it is because many of their own members also have issues with it, and they feel that by doing it bipartisan, it gives cover for everyone. So they have a co-chair, an overall co-chairs, one Republican, one Democrat on overall committee. Then the subcommittees, the three, had a co-chair from the House and from the Senate, both a Republican and a Democrat. And each committee had 16 members, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats. It was very unusual. So what he is doing in his negotiations is dealing with the other side of that issue that feels very strongly and have infused themselves and daily meet with their side of the aisle, the Speaker, Brendan Sharkey, to tell them that they want one shot for one gun, they want universal disclosure and registration of everybody instead of licensures and permitting. I mean, he's dealing and trying to find a balance that everyone can finally agree on. And it has gone back and forth. I can't even begin to tell you. We had a public hearing on this. There were 1,300 people that showed up. I had a public hearing on school safety and security. It was over 150 people, and that was a lot for a committee, but nothing compared to the gun committee. And then again, with mental health, there was, and in fact, most of the ideas that are now on the table are all the same as what was at the public hearing. There's nothing new. In fact, it's less than what was proposed. So in fact, there was a public hearing on all of this. It has been delayed. They were going to vote this week because they wanted to wait for the police report to be disclosed, which is now not only disclosed, it's in every single radio and TV program on, if you're driving or riding or coming home tonight. You're going to hear about it at night.
That happened today. It was the warrant report. It was not the full police report.
Exactly, only a portion of that
But
has been disclosed. And you're not addressing the idea that John McKinney is too close to the issue to be able to rule competently on it.
Here's and I want to address that, because at the beginning of this task force, when we had its inception, there were a number of us who pushed to make sure that Newtown representatives were on the task force. Now, I would say I was probably the least connected in the sense to the Newtown community, because I had just become a representative part of Newtown. The other representatives who represent Newtown have very strong ties there, especially in the Sandy Hook area. But I think it was important that, in a sense, that we had the Newtown people involved in the process. The problem we have now is the wheels are off the wagon. With respect to the gun control working group, it did not come anywhere close to what it was supposed to be. And I've been very intimately involved with this, and it was supposed to be a bipartisan attempt. And the concept I think we all had, we come in, we'd have a bipartisan agreement of some kind, and that a lot of the other things that could be more controversial would be left to the legislative process. And what I'm saying is, during this whole process through public safety and judiciary, all these gun bills have been moving through on their own, the whole time. Meanwhile, we're focusing on, hearing what's happening in Newtown. And the concept is that if we could have a lot of things in a really valuable discussion, we would have the stuff in the middle that mattered. The stuff we all agreed on, was common sense, that actually might reduce gun crime. Now what's happened is, and I'll tell you, I sat down for my second and final meeting of the working group. I should tell you something. Most of what we negotiated over time were going back and forth. I sat down with a list in front of me that day, and I'm looking at this list, and this is what we've been negotiating the entire time, and somebody hands me a second list. And the second list included just everything under the sun. And they presented those as the working group ideas. Now some of those, obviously, there were consensus things in the middle, but what that did was it put all these ideas back on the table, and now this is being negotiated at the leadership level in the House, just like many other bills are done. And it really undermined the entire process of what we were trying to do. Now frankly, I have major issues with this, because I've spent a lot of time, I've been living and breathing this. And the problem I have is now that the discussion is all about banning assault rifles and magazines. That's what discussion's about. There's no more discussion about extending background checks to people in the home. There's no more discussion about looking at what happens when there's a felon living in the house. There's no more discussion about those things. It's all about banning rifles and banning magazines. Now, well, you may want that, and that may be your position, and that's okay, I understand that. But we can have that debate. The problem now is, this is all being done at the leadership level, and that's why John McKinney is so deeply involved in it. And whether he wants to recuse himself or not going to happen. I don't think there's enough motivation for that among the legislature. I understand your concern, I really do. But the bottom line is, those deals are happening as we speak. And there were many of us who were pushing to make sure that we knew what happened in that report. And the reason that was that would have been the one element that would have added credibility to what we were doing on that task force. At least if we could have said, hey, this is what actually happened in Newtown. This is actually what was happening with Adam Lanza. This is actually what was used. Those were things we wanted to give credibility to what we were doing in the task force.
But we did have that report, and now we do know that that in fact the magazine size that this gentleman had were 30 capacity. We did know the type of rifles. We did know that the storage was in his bedroom and it was unlocked. We did know that he at one time tried to get weapons and he couldn't, so it was his mother's equipment. So there were things that we do know, and quite frankly, things like universal background check that everybody agrees on will be in there. There will be better storage laws. They will be in there. But some of the things that occurred were breaking all the rules that were probably already there. And quite frankly, John McKinney is just one. You've got the major players are really Senator Looney, President of the Senate, Don Williams. You've got Brendan Sharkey of the House and the Speaker, and you have his majority leader. So it's really 4 against 2, Larry Cafaro and John McKinney. So this is the driving force now in negotiating this. When we negotiated within our small working group on the consensus items for school security, we had 3 pages of consensus items and 1 page, half a page of things we could not and had no consensus. And we set the tone of how to do the process, and all the others followed suit. And so what they got from us was a lot of stuff that we all agreed on, and a little bit we didn't, so they only were going to focus on the things that we agreed upon. Mental health did the same thing, only they had a much shorter list. They had 1 page, a half a page of what they agreed on, and a page and a half what they didn't agree upon. And now in the gun committee, they had 2 full sheets of separate items that only one side or the other could agree upon. So the arbiters are now in one room together, again, 2 with 4 on the majority side, because that's the way the dynamics right now of the General Assembly is. In fact, it's been that way for over 30 years.
Well, that's a problem. This was billed to us as a task force and a working group. There was nothing about this as a working group. It's an ad hoc committee that was put together to legitimize the same process we've always done. And I have very strong criticisms of the process, because as a working group, we shouldn't have had 2 lists. We should have 1 recommendation. That's what we should have had. And each of those working groups were done like any other working group. I've never seen a working group look like that in the world. they were committees, so they just put forth a bunch of stuff that everybody thought that,
But wouldn't
But
you
that's-
say that
that's
those
right,
two
yeah.
lists, I would say 2/3 of them were almost the same?
They
There
really
were-
didn't
there were-
matter.
they-
There's a ton of overlap.
There was the
There's a
1/3
lot
that
of
they
overlap.
couldn't agree on, but there were
Yeah.
overlapping items in both of those lists.
there were 16 items on the gun list that we could agree on.
Mhm.
But I guess what I'm saying is, it doesn't really matter what we agreed on, didn't agree on, because it's no longer a negotiation we're working with.
And my issue is less with the process, and I apologize, just so you raise your hand, because it hasn't been perfect, Dan and Tony are right. It's the direction that the process has taken, which Dan referenced, because what I'm concerned about is that we're gonna miss the boat. I mean, keep your eye on what we should be focusing on. You know, assault weapons and how you define them and how big the magazines are, that's gotta be part of the discussion. But the vast majority of gun violence in our country comes from illegal handguns.
That's right.
Comes from straw purchases, stolen guns, shipped across state lines into the inner cities, but we're having a new town every 2-3 months. We're losing kids. And as horrific as the one event that happened 10 miles to the north of here, it's happening every couple of months, slowly, all around the nation. So while we should focus on a discussion about assault weapons and magazine sizes and background checks and everything else, we also have to focus on where the gun violence is. And the gun violence is, A, breaking the existing laws, and B, no one enforcing them.
Well,
So the
and
good thing that's
yeah.
gonna come out of this consensus package, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is, what appears to be, is a refunding and a reemphasis on enforcing illegal trafficking of guns. Because that's where the violence is happening.